You know what I mean?
Okay, good morning, everybody. We're in the middle of a sugya regarding if women are obliged in the mitzvah of benching biblically or rabbinically. And the discussion over here, we explained what was the two sides of the coin over here. So it's interesting, there's really three ways of looking at this. We explained it one way yesterday, but it's important to just explain a few more points over here. What was the issue of women are biblically obliged or not? Well, the Torah says, you will eat and you will be satiated and you will bless Hashem for the good land that he has given you. So the question is, number one, what kind of mitzvah is this? So we had assumed it's a mitzvah saseh shelo hazman grom. It's not a time-bound mitzvah because she can eat it anytime she wants. So what's the reason why it's not a biblical mitzvah? So Rashi says, because it says by the benching, you bless Hashem for the good land that he gives you, and women do not get a portion of the land in Eretz Yisrael. So that might be a reason to say they would not get the land in Eretz Yisrael. So the commentaries, ask questions on that, because then I guess Kohanim and Levim should not make the blessing of the benching either biblically, because they don't have a portion of the land in Eretz Yisrael. So those who answer that, well, but technically there were the 48 cities of refuge that the Levites had. They had certain privileges to the land. So therefore, that's a reason why they could be included in that. That's one answer that's given. Tosfos gives a different reason to assume why women are not included in the mitzvah. And the reason is because it also mentions in the benching the concept of bris, circumcision, which is really one of the conditions of getting the land of Eretz Yisrael. And it's also Torah. If you look in the second paragraph, we thank Hashem for a lot of things. We thank Hashem for the land of Israel. We thank Hashem for the covenant of the bris milah. We thank himself for the benching. And the Gemara tells us another place, a person does not mention the covenant and does not mention the Torah, you're not fulfilled your mitzvah of benching at all. And women are not really, they're not obliged to bris, obviously. And in Torah, they're not obliged in the mitzvah of learning Torah as opposed to mitzvahs. So that would be perhaps a reason to exclude them. That's why Tosfos learns this. Or maybe the other side is, well, only someone who's obliged in Torah and obliged in circumcision, if they don't say it, they haven't fulfilled the mitzvah. And women who aren't really able to do it, maybe they don't have that mitzvah and they're chayiv. So that's a second way of learning Gemara. And Rabbeinu Manoach offers a fascinating reason to say maybe the women are not obliged, because he's saying the real suffix is that maybe, Rabbeinu Manoach says it's maybe a mitzvah, say, shehazman grama, not as we've assumed. Why is it a time-bound mitzvah? Because they can only bench within a certain amount of time after you've eaten bread. So it's sort of like it's a time-bound mitzvah, or is it not a time-bound mitzvah? In other words, do we say the fact, well, you can eat all day long, it doesn't really matter when you want to eat, it's not a time-bound mitzvah? Or we say, no, once you're eating, it is a time-bound mitzvah. So those become all the different sides of the coin over here. There is one other question that the rabbis bring up over here is, well, if somebody's not muted and I'm hearing them moving their pages. Okay, thank you. So there's another question that's asked over here is, well, why are you saying it's rabbinic? If you're saying the issue is either it's a time-bound mitzvah, or if you're going to say they should be excluded. So if you're going to tell me that the women are rabbinically obliged because we've excused them from a mitzvah, then they're going to always be, let's say you excuse them because it's a time-bound mitzvah. If it's a time-bound mitzvah and the rabbis now include them, then what's that going to really be saying over here? Then women should be obliged rabbinically in every mitzvah, saseh shazman groma. If you're telling me they're excused because it's a time-bound mitzvah, so then let's take every mitzvah that they're excused because of a time-bound mitzvah, and they're always going to be rabbinically obliged. So why are we only dealing with this one question of benching? So that question really gets answered better according to Rashi, because really it's not because it's a time-bound mitzvah, but rather is an exclusion from the pasuk. Okay, so in this pasuk wants to include women. Maybe the rabbis felt they should be obliged in that. Be that as it may, those are the different sides of the coin, if it's rabbinic or it's biblical. And this was the shaila that the Gemara has over here. Ravina asked Rava. So now we're going to continue with the Gemara and see if we can resolve this issue.
Rabbi, just one question.
Yeah.
The first bracha in benching would apply to women just as much as men.
Yes, so that would be, yeah, so that, you're right. That's a good point you're raising.
So maybe we say they just do their first bracha.
Well, that could maybe be, or maybe you could say, listen, it's either all or nothing. You got to say the whole benching. But that's a valid question that they discuss as well, that they could be chayv in that one. So then you could say, well, listen, we can't start having, some people doing one paragraph and others doing 3 paragraphs and take out for other people. You want to have either you're doing it or you're not. But that is a valid point that you raise.
But it doesn't seem logical that a woman wouldn't be obligated to thank God for the food she ate.
Okay, so, but again, remember, she is still obliged. There's no question that a woman must bench. That's for sure the issue. So it's not like women are not going to be benching. The only question is, are they biblically obliged? So it could very well be, well, since they got to say 1 paragraph already, well, they might as well rabbinically oblige them in everything. Maybe the biblical obligation is only for the land. So Shelley, you're right. So you're right that they do have a good reason to say that first paragraph, but that's not the biblical reason to say the first paragraph.
Why?
The biblical reason is you bless Hashem for the land that he gives you. It doesn't just...
But it also says you should eat and be satisfied.
I understand, but then when you eat and you're satisfied, now there's an obligation to thank Hashem for the land. And that, why didn't the Torah just say, everyone makes a mistake and just remembers part of the pasuk. People think that's the end of the pasuk. If that was the fact, Shelley, your question's a really good question, because it's not giving us any reason why you're benching. Just bless him for it. But no, Hashem says, I want you to bless me for the good land that I gave you. So it means only if you have the land. If you don't have the land, then there's no reason to bless at all. So you're right, Shelley. So you're absolutely right. So say the first paragraph. Okay, we're going to say the first paragraph. But where in the Bible does it say you say the first paragraph?
Mm-hmm.
Right? You could say the last paragraph. It's interesting. Who wrote the liturgy of the first blessing? Anybody knows?
Yeshua?
No,
Moshe.
Okay, you got it, Shelley. Yeshua is the second bracha. The first bracha is, we thank Hashem for sustenance. For sustenance, right? So when did Moshe introduce that blessing? When the manna was falling down. And we were eating manna from Hashem. So you could say, and we did have a Torah then, and the Torah was given then, although Sefer Dvarim was written way towards the end. But so let's say chronologically, maybe everyone had a biblical mitzvah to bench 1 paragraph, because it had nothing to do with the land. Or maybe it was only a rabbinic mitzvah then too. We could theorize historically what was the degree of the mitzvah observance. Okay, the second bracha, which is Ala Aretz HaMazon, was written by Yehoshua when we entered the land of Israel. And if you look carefully, the bracha of benching is mentioned in Sefer Devarim. Sefer Devarim is the last 37 days of Moshe's life, just as the Jews are about to enter Eretz Yisrael. So it would seem, and the focus then is on the land. It's very interesting. Why didn't God command us, write the command of benching in Parshas Kedoshim, which was in the first year we came out of Egypt. Obviously, God felt they didn't need to know that mitzvah at that time. There was no need for that mitzvah because after all, the manna was falling from heaven. You got to be a moron to think that you're the one who provided your food, right? I mean, what's the whole reason why we bench? But I mean, because God said so, fine. But at least to our human limited mind, why would God give us this mitzvah? It would seem by this timing of the mitzvah, we're just about to go into Eretz Yisrael. In another month, we're going to enter it. So Moshe's going to die. The month's going to stop. We're going to be living in the land of Israel. We're going to be plowing and tilling and sowing and planting and everything we're doing. We could very well think that we're the ones who produce the food and not Hashem. That clearly could be a mistake, right? So therefore, Moshe says, and that's all in the context of God's bringing us into the land, all this, and then you will eat and drink and be satisfied. And then you have to thank Hashem. Now, what are you thanking Hashem for? For the very land that you think you're the ones who are producing. So that really becomes the biblical intent of the mitzvah. So now that only works for people who own the land, and therefore they can be mistaken and assume that, oh, it's the fact that I own land is going to give me this greatness. That's one opinion. That's the biblical mitzvah. That's the biblical mitzvah, so then women should not be obliged in the mitzvah. And then you're going to say, well, what do you mean? The Torah says they have to bench. No, the purpose of the benching is to recognize that God's the owner of the land, and that's only a problem for those who can own land. And if you can't own land, not. Clearly, that's maybe the biblical mitzvah. The rabbinic mitzvah would say, but how in the world could a person ever thank Hashem for food? What are you going to have? Half the people thanking Hashem for the food and half the people not thanking for food? And what's going to be people who don't own land? So that becomes the rabbinic application, but still they're no less obliged. That's the point. So even though, Shelley, you're saying, what about the first paragraph? So we've got two answers to that question. Number one, the first paragraph may very well not be part of the biblical mitzvah at all. So even if women say it, fine, it's a rabbinic mitzvah, or maybe the whole mitzvah only applies if you're saying all the brachas. Be that as it may, no question women have to say it. That's not a question. And maybe the main reason it's rabbinic is because they have to say the first paragraph, even though that's not really focusing on the biblical aspect of remembering the land. Okay, that's a good question you asked, and I think that brought out some good understanding of this mitzvah.
Yes, thank you.
So that's the question. So again, basically saying, do we say it's a biblical, not time-bound mitzvah, let's say, but there's a pasuk that would tend to make us think they're excluded? Or the other side of the coin is saying, you know what, a woman does not have to own the land in Eretz Yisrael, and the fact that she benefits from the fact that men have the land, and there should be a biblical requirement for that. I mean, you could hear to say, you know what, even if you don't own the land, but at the end of the day, you are benefiting as a woman from the land of Eretz Yisrael, and even though you're not farming the land, but you may be blessing the farmer and not Hashem. So you can see the two sides of the coin. So that's the issue. So that was the question that important. Ravina asked Rava, who was his Rebbe. So Toshma. Now I'm going to try to bring a proof from a brisa. So they say like this. The brisa starts off very interesting. Be'emes amru. Be'emes amru means in truth they said. So that usually means a statement that's accepted as halacha. Be'emes amru, the truth is, meaning this is the halacha. It's going to tell me, you know, this is the halacha in theory, but in practice, we don't do this for a technical reason. That's what the way we're setting up this brisa. Clear. So the brisa is saying this is the halacha based on the understanding, but that's a pragmatic reason why we're not going to do it. But the focus is what's the halacha. So be'emes amru, the truth they said is that ben mevorach laviv, a child who is a minor under bar mitzvah, may bless the benching for his father to discharge his obligation. Now, obviously, it has to be a katan who's old enough to understand mitzvahs and knows what he's doing. Now, we know that rabbinically, all children are obliged in mitzvahs. Why? For training purposes. So when a child does a mitzvah, clearly he's not 13. He does not have a Yetzer Tov that it's reasonable for Hashem to oblige a child to do any mitzvah, that if he doesn't do it, he's punished. If he doesn't have Vera, he's punished. Child's not old enough for that, so it's not fair to biblically oblige a child. Once he turns 13, okay. But so now, why do we insist that children do mitzvahs? So it's rabbinic. Because if they're not, obviously, if the kid never benches once in his life till his bar mitzvah, he's not going to be benching after his bar mitzvah. So there's a rabbinic obligation for them to bench. Now, it's interesting that commentaries discuss, is it the mitzvah of the child rabbinically, or is it mitzvah of the parents rabbinically to educate the child? Be that as it may. But the Bryce is speaking of an ignorant father. The father does not know how to bench, and the child does know how to bench. So the question is, can the child bench for the father and discharge his obligation? The father listens to everything he says. So they say, Be'emes Amru, the truth is, really, the law should be that Ben Mevorach Lavi, that a child can bench for his father. Be'eved Mevorach Larabo, and a Canaanite servant can bench for his master. The Isha Mevareches Labala, and a woman can make a bracha for her husband for the benching. That's the emes. And if you do it, it's 100% Yotze. They've all discharged the man of his obligation. But what's the reason it's not recommended not to do it? Not that it's usser, but it's strongly not recommended for a technicality. That's not changing the basic law. That's you got to remember. The law is these three people, they discharge the man's obligation. Now there's a technicality. Aval, but Amr Chacham, the rabbi said, Tava me'era la'adam she'ishta ubanav mevarchin lo. Let a curse come upon a man who remains so unlearned that his wife and children, or even Canaanite slave, should make a bracha for him that he can't read it himself. As they say in Yiddish, it's a shanda. You know, it's a what are you talking about? You're a man. You're supposed to be learning Torah. You're so ignorant. Your wife has to bench for you. So in other words, yes, the real halacha is they could do it for him. But it's discouraged because, if that's going to be, then a man will say, I never really need to know anything in Judaism. My kids will do it for me. And sometimes we've understood this. Unfortunately, when parents, came after the Holocaust, and there were many parents who, didn't want to keep a lot of Torah mitzvahs, but they wanted their kid to have a bar mitzvah. They wanted them to keep the traditions. And you see what happens. The kid said, listen, parents, you don't keep anything. Why should we do it? So obviously the rabbis look askance and discourage that a father should want his kid to be yoytze him. That you're ignorant? Why should be ignorant? So therefore they didn't want to make it just carte blanche that all these people could bench for them. But the truth is they can't. And that's the point we're trying to come out with. In other words, according to the law, a woman can bench for her husband. That's the law. Okay, there's a technicality, but that's a separate point. But the law is the law. So now let me ask you a question, guys. What does that mean? If a woman can discharge her husband's obligation, does that mean she has a biblical obligation or a rabbinic obligation?
Biblical.
It's a biblical obligation. That's what we just said. We just said the difference between her having a biblical or rabbinic obligation is if she can discharge the husband's obligation. And the Brisa clearly says the woman can. And the only reason it's discouraged is because the husband, comes across as, not caring about his Yiddishkeit. But otherwise, she can do it. So this seems to clearly be a proof that the woman is biblically obliged. And this is how the Gemara now plays out the proof. This is all good and well if you say, Doraisa, that a woman's obligation is biblical. Then we understand the Brisa, because Asi Doraisa, her biblical obligation of benching, comes along, umapik, and discharges Doraisa, his biblical obligation, which makes a lot of sense. But if you're going to say she has a rabbinic obligation, that's going to be difficult. Asi Rabbanan umapik Doraisa, can a rabbinic obligation discharge a biblical obligation? Clear proof that a woman is biblically obliged. Correct? Yes. Okay, let's see, without looking at the Gemara, let's see how you could disprove this from the Bryce itself. You're right. It would seem that the woman is biblically obliged because she's discharged the husband. But from the Bryce itself, what might tend to disagree with that? Okay, let's look at the case where the son, can the son discharge the father's obligation? According to the Bryce. Yes. Yes. And clearly everybody agrees the son's obligation is?
Training.
Rabbinic. It's rabbinic. So wait a minute. The Brisa clearly is saying that a son can discharge a father's obligation. Now that means we have to understand this, but it's telling us that the son who has a rabbinic obligation can discharge the father's biblical obligation. Now that cannot be. That cannot be. But yet the Brisa says he can do it. Now, one thing's for sure, and nobody's arguing at this point. There's no machlokas. If you have a rabbinic obligation, you cannot discharge someone's biblical obligation. That's clear. No one's going to argue on that. So we wanted to bring a proof. Well, the fact that the woman can discharge the husband must prove that she has a biblical obligation, because how else could she discharge his obligation? Okay. If you want to say that, okay, we could say that because you're not sure a woman, biblical, rabbinic, it seems to be a proof. But in the very same brisa, they're putting the three together. It's saying the son can discharge the father's obligation where there's clear and no dispute that the son only has a rabbinic obligation. And the brisa is happy with that. So there must be some other reason why the woman can, there must be another reason why the son can discharge the father's obligation. There's got to be a factor that we're not thinking of. And that must be the same factor that allows the woman to do it, that she's not biblical. So now we got to come up, how could it possibly be that the son can discharge the father's obligation? So without going ahead, what could be the only way we could answer, even though you don't know exactly what the answer is going to be?
But the father is not able to do it.
That doesn't help. If father's not able to do it, he has a biblical obligation, rabbinic obligation, cannot discharge it. So now we're going to be forced to say something that's going to be hard to understand. We'll understand it clearly. The only way this can be happening is if we're speaking in a case where the father's obligation at this point is only rabbinic. You're all going to look and say, what do you mean? How could he have a rabbinic obligation? He has a biblical obligation. Okay, so let's go over the pasuk again, guys, together. It says, v'achalta, you will eat. What's the next word? V'tzavata, you'll be satiated. Uve'rachta, and you will bless. So when does the biblical application become operative? When it's v'savata, you satiated yourself. What if it's just v'achalta? What if you just eat and you're not satiated? What's the halacha?
You don't have to bench.
Biblically, you do not have to bench. That's clear. Because why did the Torah have to say v'savata? Just say v'achalta, and you eat. Eat and bench. I don't care how much you eat. When it comes to bracha rishona, for example, which is totally rabbinic, first brachas are rabbinic. If you're just going to eat like one little crumb of bread, you have to make a motzi. Because the Torah says you can't benefit from this world without thanking God, rabbinically. Fine. But we're talking about the biblical mitzvah. The biblical mitzvah says, you have to look at every single word. First of all, you have to eat. You know, what if a guy says, I love Hashem so much, I just want to thank you for all the food in the world. No, you can't. You have to eat. If you don't eat, you're not allowed to bless. Okay, good. So now I'm eating. Then there says, you got to be full. What does full mean? Full means I'm really satiated. I'm no longer hungry. Before you eat, you're hungry. That doesn't mean to say you have to stuff yourself, but now I'm satisfied. I can walk away from the table. I can now go for another 5-6 hours. I don't have to eat any food. Then there's a biblical mitzvah. Now, what if you ate, a piece of bread, a little fish? Okay, you're not starving, but you're still hungry. Do you have a biblical obligation to bench? The answer is no. No biblical obligation. what do? We'll see later on. The Gemara is going to tell us you have a rabbinic obligation. Because it makes sense. The rabbis say, listen, what are you going to have people, taking little snacks throughout the day? I just won't, you have all these people going on a bench now anyway. Oh, I'm not going to eat bread because then I got a bench. It's not a good attitude, but there's people who do that. So people say, listen, I just won't fill my stuff. Can you imagine if this was the halach? We know the halach is you don't eat bread, you don't bench. So as it is, people, they'll have, 10 pieces of chicken, 6 pieces of fish, lots of beer and this and that, but no mazonos. I don't want a bench, right? So now imagine if the law now is that if you eat bread, but you don't satiate yourself, or if you don't satiate yourself, you don't have to bench. Right? So you don't have to satiate, so you'll always have a lot of small meals. You'll have 10 meals throughout the day. You'll have bread, all the carbs in the world you want, but there'll always be meals that you're not satiated, you'll never bench. The rabbi said, nothing to it. You eating a certain amount of bread, even if you're not satiated, you got to bench. That's rabbinic. So therefore, the only way we can make any sense of this brisa is the brisa saying a son can discharge a father's obligation when it's possible for a son to discharge a father's obligation. And the only way a son that's rabbinic can discharge his father's obligation is if the father only has a rabbinic obligation when he doesn't eat to satiation. And that's what the Bryce is saying, that since the son has a rabbinic obligation and the father presently has a rabbinic obligation, the son can discharge his obligation, and therefore you could do that, but it's discouraged because we don't want a man to be so ignorant that the son doesn't do that. That has to be the pshat in the brisa. There is no other way to understand the brisa, is that the father has had his rabbinic obligation and the son is fulfilling that. But once we're learning that, then we could say a woman only has a rabbinic obligation as well. And just like the son can only discharge the father when he has a rabbinic obligation, maybe that's exactly what the brisa means as well. And therefore, there's no proof that a woman has a biblical obligation. So that's the next 2 lines of the Gemara. So the question and the answer. Well, it's the answer is based on a question. And you wanted to say the woman's biblical because how else could she discharge the husband? But according to you, Katan Barchi Yuvahu, is a Katan a biblically obliged person? No, he's not obliged at all. So how is he able to discharge the father? What do you have to say the scenarios about for the son to discharge the father? Where the father only ate a rabbinic amount, meaning a small amount that only creates a rabbinic obligation. And what is? It's a big machlokas, Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda, as we'll learn in the 6th chapter of Berachos. One of them says an olive's amount of bread creates the rabbinic obligation, and the other says the size of an egg, which is twice as much. That's me not to satiation, but you have to eat bread. If you don't eat bread, then you don't make any benching. But the biblical comes when he eats a meal that truly satisfies him, as it says, so here the husband only has a rabbinic obligation where the son is able to discharge that obligation. So therefore we could say that the wife as well could do that as well. And then it's the Asi D'Rabbanan Mapik D'Oraisa. Now the rabbinic obligation that the child and the woman have can discharge the rabbinic obligation that the husband has, and therefore there's no proof to this. You might want to flip around and say, no, it is a proof. It seems that the woman can only do it because of the husband's obligation. No, it's not a proof that it's biblical, but it's not a proof that it's rabbinic, because it could be it's rabbinic. In other words, there's 2 ways to understand the brisa. We thought the only understanding of the brisa is the woman's biblically obliged. That's how she's yaitz to the father. But once we've now shown that part of the brisa has to be speaking where one party is rabbinic, such as this boy, then we could say that the woman is only rabbinically obliged and is discharging the husband's rabbinic obligation. Not necessarily, but it's not a proof from this brisa, because clearly the son is only discharging because he has a rabbinic obligation, the wife is discharging can be one or two ways. Either she's rabbinically obliged and and takes care of him, or maybe she's biblical. We don't know. A proof is not from here. And that's the end of the sugya. So tomorrow we will then get into the halacha. Now, when you finish the sugya, do you have any clear understanding of the halacha? No. It appears to be a question that was asked. A proof was brought. The proof was shown not to be a proof. And the Gemara just ends it at that. That means the Rishonim are going to have a field day giving us an answer if women are biblically obliged, which will then relate to, can she discharge her husband or not? We've discouraged it, but could she? Let's say the husband is ignorant. Can the woman do it? Let's say you have a Balas Tshuva. Baal Tshuva is the wife really learned how to read Hebrew. The husband didn't. And now the wife wants the bench for the husband. Okay, it's a Me'era, but still, could she do it or not? The other question is, we'll talk about tomorrow, what if another difference in Allah is, what if she's not sure if she benched? Remember, I mentioned that. If a man's not sure if he benched, since it's a suffix dairaisa, you have to bench. A woman, well, what is it? If she's not sure if she benched, does she have to bench again or not? These become the discussion points. And why did the Gemara not mention the fact that another difference of this would be if she's not sure if she benched? That we'll discuss and come out to the final halacha tomorrow, leaving you a cliffhanger for tomorrow. Till then, any wives who want to discharge their husbands got to wait till tomorrow to find out. Okay, have a good
Why
day.
didn't the Bryce say it?
What? But it's a curse, but you still should do it. I mean, if the husband can't do it, he has to discharge it. In other words, we're discouraging men to not learn. That's the point, but she could technically do it. Okay, have a good day. Try to enjoy this weather. Sai Gazon.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Rabbi. See you soon, Alex.
I like this.
See you, Alexander.